our simple servlet has all of the logic that we need to handle GET and POST requests. But the one piece that we haven't talked about is how do we route requests to this servlet? So how does the web application container that our servlet is running in know when to invoke our servlet and which operations it should handle? So if we think about this, a request gets sent with a particular path, and then the servlet container needs to know, depending on the path, which of the individual servlets should actually handle the request. So we need to set up a routing relationship so that we know, based on the path, which servlet should it be routed to. That's what this web.xml file provides. We're going to talk about web.xml files first because they're the traditional way of specifying these routing relationships to decide which paths get handled by which servlets. But as we'll talk about later, there's a newer method for doing this that's based on Java-based configuration, where you can still do all of these configuration parameterizations of your application, but you have type safety of Java, and so it's easier to make sure you do things correctly because you can make a mistake in a web.xml file. So here's a simple web.xml file for our video service that we created and the servlet for it. So we see that there is a web app declaration saying that this is a web application. And what we are doing is we are describing in this XML file the parts of our code that the servlet container or the web application container needs to know about. So when it loads our code, it needs to know what are the servlets that it should care about and what paths should it route to which servlets. So that's what this web.xml file tells it, is information about our code and how to load it and how to map requests into that code. So in this case, all we have is a simple servlet and a single mapping for that servlet. So the servlet is declared here, and we see the servlet's got a name, and then we've got a class. So this tells the servlet, go and load this particular class that I wrote, which you're telling it it's going to have to inherit from HTTP servlet, and then give it this name in this file. So whenever I'm referring to this name, it means this class. So we're describing a servlet that the web application container should go and load, and then we can refer to that name later in the file to route requests to that servlet. Now down here, we see there's a mapping. Up here is where we're declaring the server, so we are defining a servlet, and down here we're doing routing. So we're mapping requests to our servlet. So in this case, we see that we're referring to the original name of that servlet we declared, and then we're specifying a URL pattern that should be routed to that servlet. So in this case, we're going to route all requests to the /video path to that particular servlet. The URL pattern can take on a number of forms. You can have regular expression matching in the URL pattern. So you can do things like match all URLs that begin with /video, or match any URL that ends with /video. And you can have all kinds of different schemes, and the pattern here will determine how the web application container looks at paths and decides which paths should be mapped to your servlet. And if you have multiple servlets, you simply define multiple servlet tags, and you simply define multiple mapping tags for these servlets to describe how the different paths that are on the request map into different servlets. Now, as we'll see later, we're going to actually use a finer grained and more advanced routing mechanism, but for now, this is the basis. This is what goes inside of a web.xml file. And a lot of newer applications don't use web.xml. They use Java-based configuration, but the vast majority of applications that are out there still use web.xml. So it's important to know what it is and how it works.